The Watergate scandal was a major political scandal that happened in the United States between 1972 and 1974. It began with a break-in at the headquarters of Democratic National Committee at the office complex called Watergate, hence the name, in Washington, D.C. on June 17, 1972, according to the VietnamWar.info. The burglary and subsequent attempts of the Nixon administration to cover up its involvement in the affair eventually led to articles of impeachment against President Nixon and ultimately his resignation on August 8, 1974, the first and only resignation of a U.S. president to this day. The president of Watergate arose from all the economic troubles, assassination, social unrest of the 1960s, and lately the publication of Pentagon Papers in 1970. When President Nixon was running for the re-election in 1972, the states were embroiled in the lengthy, bloody, and unpopular Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, and deeply divided internally. Under such harsh political climate, a forceful presidential campaign was thought to help the president have an easier election than in 1968. Many dirty tricks, therefore, were employed during his office campaign, including harassing the opponent and bugging in their office. The Watergate scandal began in mid-1972 following a break-in at the Watergate Hotel complex on June 17th of 5 burglars. One of them was working for President Nixon's committee to re-elect the president. Both the White House and the CRP immediately denied any connection to the event. An elaborate cover-up was already underway. In October, the FBI discovered that there was a systematic and illegal spying and sabotage, and that the break-in was just part of a larger campaign conducted on behalf of CRP leaderships against the Democrats. Although those revelations could not prevent Nixon from being reelected with a landslide victory in November 1972, a political storm was brewing up. Nixon, however, refused to hand over tapes, claiming it was the president's executive privilege to keep them to himself. When Cox insisted on demanding the tapes, Nixon ordered to have Cox removed, leading to a flurry of high-profile Justice Department resignations and protests over the weekend, which was notoriously known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Eventually, the Nixon administration released some of the tapes under...
United States versus Nixon was a landmark United States Supreme Court case. This case is special because it deals with the power of the president. President Richard Nixon was testing his power as an executive official. On August 29, 1973, the Supreme Court issued a subpoena that ordered Nixon to turn in the tapes that he possessed. These tapes were recordings from the break-in at Watergate Hotel. During the Supreme Court case, Justice Potter Stewart stated that when a claim of presidential privilege as to materials subpoenaed for the use in a criminal trial is based, as it is here, not on the ground that military or diplomatic secrets are implicated, but merely on the ground of a generalized interest in confidentiality. What he is saying here is that the court points out that President Nixon is not claiming executive privilege to protect secret information that could harm the public, but he is claiming or abusing executive privilege to cover up information related to the Watergate investigation, which is the true crime, abusing his power. The U.S. District Court supported a subpoena that ordered he must turn in the tapes. The U.S. Court of Appeals didn't hear the case because it moved directly to the Supreme Court by request of a special prosecutor. The Supreme Court decided that they had jurisdiction in a case involving the executive branch or a case about the president having executive privilege. This case is such a landmark case because Richard Nixon was testing our system of checks and balances. He was claiming executive privilege. By claiming executive privilege, he was saying that he does not have to follow the order put in place by the Supreme Court simply because he is president. This is breaking the rule of law. The rule of law simply states that no government official, nor person of high power, is above the law. Nixon was claiming that because he was president, he was in fact above the law.
Alright, Thursday, August 8th, Nixon announced that he would be the first president to resign the next day. He felt he had he didn't have a strong enough political base to be in Congress. He declared he wasn't a quitter. He said as president, he would put the interest of the Americans first. He continued in his speech. Some of his judgment was wrong, but he didn't admit to his crimes. He never accepted his wrongdoing. The incident that sped this up to cause him to resign and be the first president in the United States to resign happened on June 17, 1972. 5 men were arrested breaking into the Watergate.
Nixon ignored the U.S. Supreme Court and refused to hand over the tapes. Shortly after, Richard Nixon fired Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. Now, in case you were not familiar with the job of a special prosecutor in the United States, a special prosecutor is a lawyer appointed to investigate and potentially prosecute a particular case suspected of wrongdoing. So in this case, he was appointed to suspect Watergate. Currently, in the United States, we have Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller, who is investigating the Trump administration for ties with Russia. So, to kind of give you an idea, it would be like if Trump were to fire Robert Mueller for investigating the Russia problem. It's the same as Nixon firing his special prosecutor for investigating the Watergate scandal. After Nixon fired Archibald, other members of the cabinet resigned. These firings and resignations are known as the Saturday Night Massacre. After the Saturday Night Massacre and Nixon claiming executive privilege, things just kept on heating up. Nixon was sure to be impeached. So on August 9th, 1974, Nixon resigned from his presidency, the only president to ever do so.
The aftermath of Nixon's resignation. In late 1973, the Watergate scandal had escalated to the point where it cost Nixon his political support. By May 9, 1974, the House Judiciary Committee began hearings on articles of impeachment. Judge Sirka turned over to the committee and with the evidence collected against Nixon by the grand jury. Jaworski appealed to the Supreme Court to force Nixon to surrender more tapes, and on the 24th of July, the court handed down an 8-0 decision, laying bare the president's last line of defense. In late July, the House committee drafted 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon: obstructing the Watergate investigation, misuse of power, also violating his oath of office, and failure to comply with House subpoenas. This bold move and the decision of the Supreme Court mounted more pressure onto Nixon. And on August 5th, Nixon released tapes of 3 conversations between himself and Haldeman recorded 6 days after the break-in. The text shows the president obstructing justice by ordering the FBI to end its investigation of the break-in. Nixon would resign on August 9, 1974, facing insurmountable odds of being impeached and removed from office. Minutes later, Vice President Gerald Ford is sworn in as the 38th President of the United States. In taking the oath of office, Ford spoke to the American people and gave these words of relief and assurance. My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not men. Here the people rule. The new president faced many difficulties. Besides having to handle the continuing legal and political concerns surrounding Richard Nixon, domestic and international challenges and the War of Vietnam lingered, and the selection of a vice president demanded attention. With the need to put Nixon's ordeal behind him and give full attention to the economy and foreign policy, Ford reached a decision. And on September 8, 1974, President Ford issued a full unconditional pardon for any crimes that Richard Nixon might have committed against the United States while president. President Ford did this because it was the best interest of the country. Although the pardon for Richard Nixon was very controversial and it probably was a factor that led to Ford losing the presidential election in 1976. As President General Ford, he made a controversial decision to pardon former President Nixon and to end the trauma of Watergate. In doing so, he placed the love of his country ahead of his political future. The Watergate scandal to this day is in a league of its considering the outcome of Nixon's presidency. It marked a change in the role of the media and how it correlates to Washington, D.C. Nixon in the next few years would give a series of famous interviews that would provide even more damning insight to the legacy and perceived powers of the presidency and Nixon's inflated sense of self-worth. Post-Watergate is often associated with the rising tide of apathy towards politics and federal public service. Watergate defined a much needed former for political investigation and that has been applied in the Iran-Contra scandal of the 1980s, the Bill Clinton impeachment investigation of 1990s, and the current Russia probe plays that Trump administration to this very day.